Okay. Welcome back to those of you who've been here before. I see a few familiar faces. Tonight we're going to go a little bit deeper into trying to understand the actual experience of people who are psychotic. Talk about, in particular, delusions and hallucinations. But first, I'll reprise what we covered last week. We talked about psychosis and schizophrenia. And I think the core tensions within psychosis, really probably the main tension, is are these experiences, are these symptoms meaningfully connected to one's life experiences or not? Because the dominant medical model argues that they are not. They're meaningless expressions of a diseased brain. Many of us think otherwise. And where is psychosis located? Is it really in the individual? Are we talking about a breakdown in communication between an individual and another individual, or the world? And then really, when we're talking about the utility of the word, does it really tell us much more than saying someone is delusional or saying that they have hallucinations? What really does the word psychosis tell us at this point? So then we moved to schizophrenia, and we talked about the concept of schizophrenia from its historic origin in the early 1900s with Eugen Bleuler and Carl Jung. And I argued that the original conception was quite closely connected to the concept of dissociation. Schizophrenia literally means split mind. And the concepts of splitting and complexes were very central to Bleuler's ideas. Splitting really is basically dissociation, although later in psychoanalytic concepts it came to serve a somewhat different purpose. And complexes, or emotionally charged complexes, really are dissociative parts of the personality. Jung was particularly clear about this in his publications throughout his lifetime. We also talked a little bit about the relationship between Freud and Bleuler and Jung, and Freud was he wanted very much to have Bleuler and Jung apply his new ideas from the early 1900s about infantile sexuality to schizophrenia. And you can see between Jung and Freud in particular many letters going back and forth in which Jung says, we're trying to make sense of your theory and we try to do this, but it doesn't quite fit, and how can you explain this? And then Freud comes back basically implying, you fool, can't you understand the simple truths that I'm putting forward? But really, Jung was, in many ways, much more influenced by Pierre Genet than by Sigmund Freud. And through Jung's influence, Bleuler's concept of schizophrenia was powerfully informed by notions of trauma and dissociation. And we talked a bit about Kurt Schneider, who in the middle 20th century proposed these first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia. Also have come to be called Schneiderian symptoms. And these symptoms had a very powerful impact on the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia for most of the past 50 years, really. In particular, certain types of auditory hallucinations, certain types of voice hearing, and passivity phenomena, which are referred to, I think incorrectly, as delusions, feeling that your actions or your thoughts or your emotions are being controlled by an outside force. We know from research that actually these kind of symptoms are more common in dissociative identity disorder than in schizophrenia. So even though Schneider said these are predictive of schizophrenia, they're more common in dissociative disorders. And we speculated a little bit last week about why that might be the case. The current diagnosis of schizophrenia still relies very heavily on psychotic symptoms. And because of this, and because in particular of the overlap between the presence of these Schneiderian symptoms in dissociative disorders, there's good reason to believe that every sample of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia includes a significant minority of people who really have a dissociative disorder, or we would say more accurately would be giving a diagnosis of dissociative disorder. And studies consistently show at least 10%, and in some studies significantly more, have higher levels of trauma and dissociation. On the other hand, what schizophrenia does present with that dissociative disorders don't are negative symptoms, particularly flat affect, social withdrawal, cognitive impairment, and certain types of disturbances of self, what some people call the fragmentation of the ego, that are not typical of dissociative disorders. Okay, so with that as the background, we're going to move now into talking about delusions and hallucinations. And I'm primarily going to be drawing on chapters from the second edition of our book, one about childhood experiences and delusions, which I wrote with a Italian infant memory researcher. You didn't think there were any of those out there, but there really is, an infant memory researcher. Fascinating guy. And then a couple of papers on auditory verbal hallucinations that we've done. Dirk Korstens and I were, as far as I know, really the first to argue that voice hearing is better conceptualized as dissociative than as psychotic. And now there's pretty good evidence for that, as you will see. So I'll talk briefly about psychotic symptoms in general, other than hallucinations and delusions, other than auditory verbal hallucinations. Then we'll spend time talking about voice hearing related to dissociation and dissociative disorders, and delusions related to trauma and also related to memory. So the take-home message that I'm going to give you is that voices are closely related to dissociation. Delusions really have a great deal to do with memory, and they're both related to trauma, really. Okay? All right, we won't spend much time talking about it today, but psychotic symptoms classically include hallucinations, delusions, and then what is often called disorganized thought or speech or disorganized behavior. So these are actions, behaviors that don't make sense or to other people or not easily understood, and language which doesn't make sense. And I did a paper some years ago on catatonia, in which we argued that catatonia basically was what's called tonic immobility in the animal kingdom, which is a terminal fear response. You might think of it as playing dead, that when the predator is on top of the prey and the prey has no other option, in many species it will pretend to be dead, but really as a ploy to try to escape. So what you see in many of these animals and what you see in humans, often who are catatonic, is that they're not moving, they appear to be mute, they may be somewhat insensitive to touch, but they're actually quite aware. And often, afterward, they will tell you they knew everything that was going on when they were in this catatonic stupor, and they were very anxious, they were very frightened. So we've argued that this is a manifestation of an evolutionarily based fear response. And many other types of bizarre behavior, again, might make sense if we knew what the life story was, if we knew what the context was, if we knew what the trigger was, if you will. Thought disorder is really quite interesting. There's a paper by Michael Robbins, who's a psychoanalyst, some years ago on the language of schizophrenia, and what the paper primarily consists of is a kind of very detailed interview with one of his patients, who, with his permission, worked on this article together. And a lot of it consists of him trying to understand why she talks in such a strange way. So you see his quote here saying, well, why do you say things this way and not more clearly? And this has to do with an incident in which she's asking for help. And she says, the way I said it is brilliant. Besides, it keeps me at a distance from people, puts me in a separate space where they won't know what I'm talking about, how much distress I'm in. So, and I'll read you the next one because it's even more clear. Relationships are too difficult, so I word my way into a relationship with letters. And this is play on the English expression to work my way into something. I word my way into a relationship with letters. And also, of course, that's ambiguous as to whether she's talking about letters that one writes to other people or letters as part of a word. I'd like to work my way into your hearts without working my way in and without mentioning things that would work my way out of your hearts. So in this particular case, and probably in other cases, really what she's saying is that I'm trying to get close to someone else, I'm trying to ask for help, but it's too scary to do this openly, so I have to do it in a very clever, complicated, symbolic way. But it really is about an expression of despair and an expression of wanting to be close but being too frightened of what might happen. All right, so we'll move very quickly to voice hearing, but first I would just want to suggest to you that any type of hallucination can basically be a form of a flashback, a sensory flashback. And remember when we talked about trauma and PTSD, flashbacks are re-experiencing. And the classic flashback is when somebody is pulled powerfully back into the traumatic event. And they're seeing things, hearing things, smelling things, feeling things back in the experience itself. But you can have just portions of that. So people can hallucinate a smell. Actually, this is fairly common. And the smell may be related to an earlier life experience or have some symbolic connection as well. Sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations. I'll talk about a few cases later on where this is quite clear. People's bodily sensations are flashbacks to earlier experiences, but they don't know they're flashbacks. They don't recognize that they're flashbacks. They're bodily experiences that then become misinterpreted. But I think that voice hearing is a little bit more complicated even than this, because all of these things can be memory related, but voice hearing goes beyond that. Right, so when we talk about voice hearing, the first thing to remember is that in many cultures, hearing voices and talking to voices when no one is around is like the extreme image of madness. So if you're trying to illustrate that someone is crazy, Wahnsinnig is more delusions, verrückt is probably better, you will show somebody talking to themselves, right? Or responding to voices that are not there. And as I said earlier, this symptom was very heavily emphasized in the diagnosis of schizophrenia for many, many decades. So for quite a long time, until 2013 in America, if you heard a voice commenting on your behavior, that is, you're sitting in that white chair watching that funny guy talking, right? Voice saying this to you. That was the only symptom you would need to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. You'd have to have other criteria as well. They'd have to go on for a period of time and your level of functioning was impaired, but that was the only symptom you needed, or one or more voices talking with each other, right? Very, very heavily emphasized, and still is heavily emphasized, but they've backed off of it for a little bit. At the same time, we've known for a long time, many people hear voices and are not called schizophrenic. Visionaries, mystics, artists of various sorts. And also, I'm working with a PhD student in Denmark who's looking at hallucinations after the death of a spouse. And this is very common. It's very common. People will hear the voice, see their partner, frequently sense their presence. This is related to grief. This is not schizophrenia. But in certain circumstances, somebody like that could be diagnosed with this, and that's the problem with the criteria. PTSD and DID also have these symptoms quite often. So how do we understand this? How do we understand that hearing voices is considered a cardinal symptom of schizophrenia, and yet it's common in people who should not be called schizophrenic? Well, The way most people have understood this is this concept called pseudo hallucinations. And pseudo hallucinations, anything like pseudo or quasi, means that it's not really entirely the same thing as genuine hallucinations. And it's been argued, people have had this concept for over 150 years, basically to try to not consider everyone who has these experiences psychotic or schizophrenic. And the way they've distinguished between pseudo-hallucinations and genuine hallucinations has varied, but very often these are the criteria. Maintenance of insight. Is the person aware that it's them talking to them in a way? Or do they think it's God or demon, the CIA? And perceived location of voices. Voices heard inside of your head versus voices heard through your ears, as you're hearing my voice now, through your ears. How many of you have been taught this, by the way, that genuine hallucinations, real hallucinations, are experienced in external space, outside of the head? No? No one? Okay. Because it's very, if you work with people who are psychotic, at least up until recently, in many countries, you're being taught this, that only genuine hallucinations occur through the ears. So what is the evidence for this? Well, there's actually not a lot of evidence for this. Here's one particularly good study done a few years ago, just comparing people who hear voices and have a diagnosis of psychosis and people who hear voices and have no diagnosis. Right? What does that mean, they have no diagnosis? That they're functioning reasonably well. They're working, they're going to school, they're in relationships, they're not powerfully impaired by their voices, and many of them may feel that they have some advantage by having these companions that they can speak with. And the healthy voice hearers had to hear a voice at least once a month. They found, first of all, they did not differ on perceived location. And this is absolutely consistent in the literature. There is, I'm not aware of any study that shows people who hear voices with a schizophrenia diagnosis are more likely to have external voices than healthy voice hearers. There's no evidence of that. There's a lot of variation, and there's also variation within an individual, which is very interesting. Some people may hear many voices. Some of them are inside of their head, and some of them are through their ears. Now, it may seem strange to you to think of someone hearing a voice in their head. What does that mean? To those of us who don't hear voices, we have our thoughts, and our thoughts are verbal for most of us. But this has a much, much more auditory quality. And importantly, there's a sense that it's not me, it's not mine, or it doesn't belong to me in a usual sense. The loudness, the number of different voices, this is very striking. The average number of voices that these psychotic patients were experiencing was 11. 11 different voices, and 7 in the healthy controls. Quite typically, they did not assess for dissociative disorders, so I would wonder, where does dissociation play a role in this? And they concluded, and personification, how much like a person is your voice? The answer almost always is very much like a person. I relate to this voice as I relate to people in the real world. Feels like a person to me. So they say this seems like a similar phenomenon. Patients' voices were more frequent, they were longer, more distressing, and more negative in content. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Yes?
Sorry, you were saying personification feels like a person as opposed to what else?
Well, a sound. You know, when people hear voices in their head, you could theoretically hear something, for example, as if you're in a room where a television is playing and somebody's speaking on that. You could hear a voice, you could hear someone talking, but you might not think of it as a person. So it's a good question, because in a way, what else could these things be? But this is on a continuum, and these people felt that these were very much like people in the real world, or, you know, as opposed to, ghosts or something very much fleeting. or passing. So very, in other words, very real-like. They seemed very real. Now here's one interesting thing though. And we only have a few studies that have addressed this, but they've all found this, that people with psychotic disorders who hear voices, they start later. So they start around the same time the other symptoms start. Schizophrenia classically is late teens, early 20s in men, somewhat later in women. But in controls and the healthy ones, they were hearing voices at a much earlier age. Early adolescence, sometimes even earlier, because this is the average there. Martin Dorr, he's a colleague of mine from New Zealand. He did a study where he compared voice hearing in people with schizophrenia and people with diagnosis of DID. Again, in the dissociative disorder folks, more voices earlier. The voice hearing started earlier. They found more voices in DID patients. Child voices, much, much more common in dissociative disorders than in schizophrenia. Hearing the voice of a child or the sound of a child crying. And these are the Schneiderian symptoms, voice hearing symptoms, voices commenting, voices conversing, several times more common in dissociative identity disorders. So, consequently, these people could easily have been diagnosed with schizophrenia if the person didn't really know what they were doing. And there's also, again, no difference on location. The perceived mood, if you will, of the voice, what kind of mood does it seem to be in, is different from the person's own mood, also over time. And there were other studies as well that found similar results. This is a nice study done here in Germany. Stefan Choka. I can't remember quite where he's based, but he looked at women with borderline personality disorder, and you may remember I've talked about borderline personality disorder as possibly being a dissociative disorder, or some of them being dissociative. The PANS is the classic interviewer-based instrument to assess positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. DES is Dissociative Experience Scale. It's a questionnaire, and CTQ is Childhood Trauma Questionnaire. And this is the diagnostic interview for dissociative disorders, which takes a lot of training and is rarely used in studies. But their findings are very interesting. First of all, a bit more trauma in borderline personality than schizophrenia, more delusions, more thought disorder, more negative symptoms in schizophrenia. On hallucinations, they're the same. So there are no significant differences in the amount of hallucinations. Once again, voice hearing starts earlier in people with borderline personality disorder. So DID, borderline personality disorder, healthy controls, voice hearing starts earlier. Being controlled by the voices. So this is the sense that these really are the Schneiderian symptoms we're talking about, these passivity symptoms. Do you feel as though your actions are being controlled by another force? In this case, more than half of the people felt that their behaviors were controlled by their voices, by a voice. Not common in schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia, one second, people with schizophrenia may often hear a voice telling them to do things. But in DID or borderline personality disorder, the person may actually feel that their actions are controlled by the voice. Okay. So in a funny way, these people are probably more at risk for suicide or other types of actions because those parts of them can actually make them do these things. Did you have a question? Oh, okay, all right. And just a quick aside, people who are very dissociative and have suicidal voices, or you might say homicidal voices, because these parts of them don't actually think they're living in the same body as the other person. It's a really kind of weird thing. So in a way, when you engage with these parts of the person, they want to get rid of this other part they don't like, but they don't really realize they're all living in the same body. They don't realize that if I kill her, I'm going to kill myself. And so some of the therapeutic work is actually around proving that to them. And in this case, you know, again, this idea that dissociative disorders are really underdiagnosed. Almost 100% of the people with BPD met diagnostic criteria for dissociative disorder. I'm not entirely sure. Well, I think actually, yeah, the more severe types of dissociative disorders, and none of those with schizophrenia. This is a sophisticated clinician, so he knew what he was looking for. In most cases, you will find people with dissociative disorders and schizophrenia. Here's a recent study that carefully reviewed the literature and said, let's look at all the characteristics we can think of in voice hearing, in auditory verbal hallucinations. And they looked at people with schizophrenia, they looked at other diagnostic groups, and they looked at so-called healthy voice hearers, non-clinical controls. And there are no significant differences. No significant differences except for age of onset. Once again, people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia report voice hearing starting later in life. We have to take it with a grain of salt because, as we'll talk about a little bit later, memory processes in people with psychotic disorders are quite poor. But if this is a real finding, a genuine finding, it may give us some kind of a clue as to what kind of differences are we talking about here. All right. So one question to ask at some point really is, well, how come some of these people end up in the hospital and other people seem to function reasonably well? And there's a number of factors that appear to be relevant. Obviously, emotional reaction. Any kind of a psychiatric disorder, the more it is associated with overwhelming anxiety or depression, the more at risk a person is. In this particular case, how frightened were people of their voices? The non-patients, none of them were. Almost all the patients were frightened of their voices, fearful to engage in. Control over the voices. Can you make them go away? Can you summon them if you want to talk to them? People who could talk with their voices, have a conversation with their voices, felt much better. If the person felt that they were being lectured to, like being in a room with Donald Trump, for example, and couldn't have a conversation, they were more distressed. If they could engage in some sort of a conversation, they felt much better. And then importantly, delusional elaboration. People who hear voices but do not develop delusions generally do fairly well. Only 3% of them required a needs-based diagnosis, required clinical care, whereas almost a quarter with hallucinations and delusions required care. So delusions place you at a much higher risk of needing care or hospitalizations than hallucinations by themselves. Okay. 2 weeks ago, we talked about dissociation, and here's one of the quotes that Vanderhart Nijenhuis presented, that dissociation is a division of the personality in which each part has its own rudimentary first-person perspective. So at a very basic level, at least, its own view of itself, other people in the world. And in principle, the person should be able to engage with their parts, in other words, talk with their voices, and the therapist should be able to do that as well, in principle. Here's what Eugen Bleuler had to say about hallucinations. Independent of the conscious personality, wishes and fears regulate ideas to their liking and combine them in a compact complex whose expressions emerge as hallucinations. These appear to be so deliberate that they simulate a third person, but it's merely a piece of the split-off personality. So this is the psychiatrist who created the diagnosis of schizophrenia, arguing that voice hearing are representations of split-off parts of the personality. Bleuler did not emphasize hallucinations as a necessary part of schizophrenia. He thought they were in a whole range of disorders. So, actually, I'm going to start with this bottom issue here. A meta-analysis was done recently that looked at all studies that related dissociation to voice hearing. And they found very consistently in all populations measures of dissociation strongly predicted voice hearing, correlations of 0.5. I don't know if any of you have a research background. This is a very robust correlation, a very strong correlation. I'm hearing something. Is it the plant?
There was a voice.
Is it the plant?
Inner critic.
Yeah, this is a very strong and robust correlation. And this has led to some other studies that have looked at, for example, at the relationship between childhood trauma and voice hearing, factoring in dissociation. And what they have also found is that it's dissociation, more than childhood trauma per se, that's the important factor. Highly dissociative individuals who are traumatized are much more likely to hear voices than highly traumatized individuals who are not particularly dissociative. Childhood trauma, as we'll see, is relevant for delusions, but dissociation is not as relevant to delusions. Okay, so I think I might give you a bit of an example here before I finish off with hallucinations. Some years ago, I worked with a woman in Scotland who had been diagnosed psychotic and was on antipsychotic medications for a while, and had all sorts of issues with self-harm. She actually had an 8-year-old son who was somewhat autistic, and she did a really good job with him, actually. And she heard 7 voices. And having been trained in this approach, if you're working with somebody who hears voices, one of the easiest things you can do is ask the person as you're sitting with them, are you hearing the voice now? You know, while they're in the room with you in therapy, are you hearing any voices? And if they say yes, then you can ask, does your voice have any questions for me? Or does your voice have an opinion about what we're doing? Right? There are sort of simple ways to engage this. Many people may be frightened of it. But we began doing some work with our voices, and one of the things you discover is that things are not what they seem. Many people hear voices that say terrible things to them. And what you will realize as you begin to work with people is that they're concerned about something, and they're frightened about something, and they're worried about something, and it's not necessarily what is coming across. What happens sometimes is that nobody's paying attention to them, so they will up the ante. Do you know that expression in English? They'll kind of throw a temper tantrum or scream and yell because nobody's listening to them. So a little example from this person is she heard the voice of her mother. She was terribly abused, this person. Her mother was quite nasty, but she was also sexually abused by stepfather and others. And the voice of her mother was particularly critical of her mothering, of her parenting. So this voice was always saying things like, why are you doing that? You're a terrible mom. When we began to work, and she would find this very upsetting, of course, because she was trying her best, and she was actually quite good. When we began to work with this voice, we realized that it had a particular fear, a particular worry. Anyone want to take a guess what that was? What the worry of this voice was?
Worried she'd be like her?
No, more related to the woman's own life, actually. Sorry? What are the consequences if she was a terrible mother? She'd lose her child. She'd lose her child. This voice, this part of her, was terrified that if she wasn't the perfect mother, given her diagnosis, given her circumstances, the state would come and take it away, take her child away. So she actually was trying to help this person, but she wasn't doing a very good job. And then part of what you do is you negotiate. You say, well, okay, so if this is your strategy, if this is your goal, is it working? Is she actually getting better? No, she isn't. And we were able to negotiate that this part would sometimes say nice things when she did something well, but also continue to offer advice, and their relationship got much better. She was never the favorite part of the favorite voice of my patient, but she took on this role. And the other thing you see very, very frequently is the voices of the abusers, the voices of the perpetrators, which almost all sexually abused people experience. Often this has to do with self-blame. So this is often about feeling that it's my fault that this happened to me. And there are good psychological reasons why people develop those ideas in the first place. But if you can understand that this is the part of the voice, the part of the person that feels guilty and ashamed and responsible for what happened, then you can work with that. You can go beyond what initially is being heard. I must go on though, because we have more we need to cover here. So we've started to find now there's a lot of similarities, which would lead me to argue that voice hearing really is dissociative, but there's some differences. And Salvador Perona Garcelan out of Sevilla has done a lot of work in this area, and he thinks that there may be some interesting differences in terms of what kind of things lead to voice hearing in different people. And with non-clinical voice hearers, the healthy ones, he talks about absorption. So absorption is this intense focus, in the case of these people, on their inner experiences, so that they can intensely experience their thoughts and feelings, and over time, these may take on the characteristics of a voice. Whereas in people with psychotic disorders, I think it's much more about depersonalization, about distancing oneself from experiences and not being able to integrate it. So the take-home message about voice hearing is that it doesn't make sense to call these things psychotic. So I would actually argue that we should never call voices psychotic. It doesn't tell us anything. The types of experiences that people with psychotic diagnoses have are very much the same as people with no diagnosis or post-traumatic diagnoses. Phenomenologically, it's basically identical. Now, the voices they hear might be a little more limited, a little circumscribed, they might have less of a repertoire, but essentially they are the same things. And the treatment approaches that you use, and this has been used with people with psychotic diagnoses very successfully, is you try to engage with them. And you know, part of what this can involve, very, very simple approach. Instead of the person trying to distract themselves constantly throughout the day, which make voices worse because they want to be heard and recognized, you tell somebody, take a half an hour every day, after dinner, quiet time, sit in your room, don't do anything else, and listen to what the voices are telling you. You don't have to respond, you don't have to do anything, you certainly don't have to act on what they tell you, but just pay attention. And for some people, not everyone, but for some people, what happens? The voices reduce during the other parts of the day because they know they have their time, right? You know, in a way, they learn that there's a space and time for them, and this can expand and ultimately be more effective. Now, we don't really know whether all voices are dissociative. The important issue is, can people talk with them? And can other people talk with them? Not everyone appears to be able to do this, but this might simply be a consequence of overwhelming fear. Because, you know, the things that are being said to them are very, very scary. And it takes a lot of effort to try to listen and to pay attention to them. So these are the things that, and we need to do research on this. We have not really done research to identify, can everyone potentially engage with their voices, communicate with them, and could this potentially be beneficial? But the more we try it, the more effective it is. And the people that I know who do this work a lot believe that they can work with anyone who hears voices. Okay, so in general about hallucinations, the whole range of hallucinations can be flashbacks. Voice hearing is not useful for differential diagnosis. You can use it possibly as a clue that the person might have a dissociative disorder, but certainly do not use it to suggest psychosis. Just bracket it. Look at what else is going on in the person. It may be that people with schizophrenia who hear voices don't have quite as much dissociation as people in these other groups, because the voices don't control their behavior, the voices are not quite as personified, probably. We don't know for sure. So my argument is that they're the same thing in essence, but they may be a lesser degree of the same phenomena. Okay. Why don't we move on? We'll have time for questions at the end, because now we need to spend time talking about delusions. Now, delusions are really the essence of psychosis. So when people offer definitions of psychosis, they almost always emphasize this more than anything, that this is the core of psychosis. And our current ideas of what delusions are come from a guy named Jaspers, Karl Jaspers, also German. All the best ideas came from Germany. Or Austria. Many of them did. Jaspers distinguished between secondary delusions and primary delusions. Secondary delusions were explanations. I'm going to argue that all delusions are explanations. But primary delusions, he said, were psychologically irreducible, ununderstandable, incomprehensible. And these could be really anything. The content was not so important, but he argued that there was a strong emotional state which he called Wahrnehmung, which preceded the development of primary delusions. And we're going to return to Wahrnehmung because it's very interesting. There's not a good English translation of this, Mood or atmosphere, delusional mood or atmosphere. Mood is something very contained. It can be within a person. Atmosphere, we usually talk about in English as literally being the air, the atmosphere.
What about proprioception?
Sorry?
Proprioception.
Well, that's often also about the body. I mean, you can talk about the mood of a room. This is really the feeling, the general feeling of a place.
Kind of point like foreboding and then like
For-
feeling you get in surreal state.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Foreboding is a big part of it. But, Stimmung in general is this, what does it feel like? What's the sense going on? Briefly, but importantly, bizarre delusions are also heavily emphasized in schizophrenia, and these, once again, are probably dissociative. These are Schneiderian, first-rank symptoms, delusions of control, thought insertion, that should be withdrawal. We talked about last week, could easily result from a dissociative disorder. Another part of me is controlling my thinking or my feelings or my actions. So that's another problem with the diagnosis. Definitions of delusions, they're typically argued to be false beliefs that are based on incorrect inference, that you can't argue people out of their delusions, that they're implausible. This is kind of a typical argument for it. But these have been strongly criticized. Like many things, when you try to define what's delusion, you can come up with all sorts of counterexamples. A person can have a belief that turns out to be true and accurate. I mean, for example, I could believe, for no clear basis, that the CIA is spying on me, and maybe they really are.
Yeah.
But that's not how my idea came about. So it could be true. And you can also argue people out of their delusions potentially. So it's really hard to come up with a good definition of what this is. It's not so important for us tonight, but there are interesting areas there. So psychologically, many people are arguing now that delusions, and what do I mean by delusions? Things like paranoia, feeling that somebody's trying to kill me or someone's trying to poison me, or grandiosity, that I have tremendous power. I can control the weather. That's an interesting, weird delusion. People will sometimes think they can control the weather or can control the stock market because they always know right beforehand when something is going to happen, they feel. Or, very importantly, delusions of reference, which is where I feel that something in the environment has a special meaning for me. So if I see a yellow car, yellow in English can also mean coward. It means I'm a coward. See 2 or 3 yellow cars, the world is telling me I'm a coward. So delusions, we think, can be explanations, that they're basically a way of trying to make sense of something strange that's happening. Brendan Maher talked about anomalous experiences, strange experiences. And these British psychologists argue that delusions are basically attempts to explain something that the person has experienced. And interestingly, they're associated with anxiety, but people become less anxious as they become delusional. So delusions actually serve to reduce someone's anxiety. Why would that be the case? Well, let's say that I feel terrified because I think something horrible is going to happen to me. And all of a sudden I realize that it's the cameraman there who's trying to kill me. It's not really a camera, it's actually a gun. That's all I have to worry about now. So I don't have to worry about the lamps or the sounds or these funny plants and the poisons they might be releasing. I have a specific fear, and fear is always easier to deal with than anxiety. Always easier to deal with than anxiety. And there's now very good evidence that trauma is important in the development of delusions, including things like bullying, by the way. Bullying, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And there's been studies that have supported this. There's actually a lot of very good large-scale studies, many of them prospective, so people are followed up over time. And you can demonstrate that people who are traumatized are at greater risk of developing delusions years later, potentially. But here's a particularly nice study out of Australia. Population-based study. People were asked about delusional experiences, they were asked about trauma. They controlled for a lot of other important variables. They found about half of their sample experienced a trauma and were using trauma in the unfortunate way to mean a specific event in the world. Delusional experiences were endorsed. So people said yes, they have experienced some kind of delusions. Only 2% with no trauma history. So if you weren't exposed to any kind of a severe life-threatening event or some other definition of trauma, you're very unlikely to be delusional. 5% of people with a trauma history but not PTSD, but 18% of people with PTSD. Almost 1 in 5 people with PTSD also had delusions. This is significantly larger than the trauma history, which really again tells us that it's not so much important what happens to you, but what you do with that, how you deal with that. If you're able to resolve that, if you're able to integrate that, you're not so much at risk. Sorry, my computer is taking on a life of its own. I'm not in control. So PTSD is associated with a 6.5 times risk of delusions, and particularly PTSD from rape. So people who had been raped were 18 times more likely to develop delusions than people who had not been traumatized. And they concluded delusional experiences were associated with all types of trauma, but the association was especially strong in those who had reported rape. And again, this is another thing that tells us so strongly, we have to be so careful about diagnosing schizophrenia when people have psychotic symptoms. These are people who are psychotic because of a trauma. Do we really want to call it schizophrenia? I think there's some other sort of a diagnosis, if we need one, that would make more sense. And there's been many other studies like this. And we can certainly speculate why rape might be the most powerful. I don't think it's that difficult to understand. The person's complete lack of existence, lack of being able to protect themselves in any sort of a way, and being affected.
During the event a lot of the time.
Often, yeah. There's some really interesting stuff around that. Also, the powerlessness and the immobility and the not being able to call out, and the effects that has on people, because it's all involuntary. It's completely evolutionarily driven. So Amy Hardy, a British psychologist, has argued that there's a close relationship between trauma and psychosis, and what she talks about, and we don't have time to get into memory too much today, but it's very, very important in this area, that trauma-based perceptual memory intrusions may occur in the absence of any episodic context, so that they're experienced in the here and now with no recollection of their link to past trauma. So basically, people are having some form of memory intrusion. Intrusion meaning it's popping into their mind. It's coming unbidden into their mind. They're not trying to remember something, it's just coming back. And they don't know it's a memory. They don't know it's a memory. So what do they think? They think something's actually happening. I mean, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. There's a logic to that. I'm experiencing something. I don't know this comes from my past, I'm going to assume it has something to do with the present. And we made the same argument in the first edition of our book. What complicates this in people with schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, their memory systems are messed up in the first place. They don't have good autobiographical memory. They can't remember things well. And their working memory is quite impaired too. So if you ask the question, how does trauma affect people that has really bad memories? I think they're probably more at risk of developing some of these ideas, some of these delusions. Again, we go in detail of this in the chapter. We don't have time to remember this, to talk about this now, to remember this. But this whole notion of infantile amnesia, that people can't remember things that happened to them in the first 2 years of life, it's pretty wrong in many ways. As adults, we can't remember things that happened early on. And at the same time, we know people are powerfully affected by what happens in their first few years of life, so they must be able to store this information somehow, or it wouldn't be affecting them. And now there's some very interesting research that is suggesting that people can remember their memories, particularly memories from infancy when they are still children. So when, I don't know if any of you have children or have experiences like this, but if your child is 8 or 9 or 10 years old, actually it seems to be able to remember things that happened when they were 9 months old, but not when they become teenagers. So something happens in the transition from childhood to adolescence where we lose the capacity to recall what happened to us when we were very young. We lose, and it may have to do with this pruning that goes on, the neuronal pruning between the frontal lobes and the limbic system. So you lose access to these memories, but they are still there.
So they're then called implicit memory.
Implicit memory, which is just what we're going to talk about now. Did you know what I was thinking?
Yes, I did.
I thought so. I thought you could read my thoughts. John Bowlby, many of you know Bowlby, of course, but you may not know this article. This is a wonderful article from 1979, and it's called Knowing What You Are Not Supposed to Know and Feeling What You Are Not Supposed to Feel. It's a great, great article. And part of what he talks about in this article is stories, a research study that looked at children who found one of their parents either having completed suicide or attempting suicide. And invariably what happened, that reality was denied. The other parent would make up a story, tell other people that the father or mother died this way, tell the child that they died this way. And there's a story he reports in this paper of a patient in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis who was having all these terrible symptoms, including choking symptoms, and the therapist simply asked him, did you ever walk in on somebody who was hanging themselves? And it all came back to this person. And the interesting thing is, he said, it wasn't as though I had forgotten this, but it was as though I had never been given permission to remember it. Yeah, and in this particular case, the father admitted, yeah, that's exactly what happened. She had tried to kill herself. He walked in on it, was never talked about, never acknowledged. Even more strikingly, William Nederland talked about had a patient who dreamt that he was on the North Pole, in his bed on the North Pole, and he was freezing. And while he was reporting the story to Nederland, he looked to the door of the therapy room. And he did this with some expression on his face and in some way that Nederland had the impression that it was like a child waiting for his parents to come through the door. And he shared this with his patient, and what came out was a reconstruction of this person being an infant lying in a crib and freezing. And something occurred. It's not really reported in this is from an Alice Miller chapter actually, but Nederland got a call from the patient's mother later that day saying, how dare you share my secret? How dare you let our secret out? And what the story was is that when this child was 9 months old, he was sleeping in his crib in a different room from the parents, and the parents had accidentally left the window open in the middle of a freezing blizzard. And the child nearly froze to death. And he was crying the entire night, but the parents had been trained to ignore the cries of their child. And they felt so guilty that they never talked about this. Child was hospitalized, fully recovered, was never spoken about, but his body remembered the incident.
That's in the cult's work, the body keeps the score.
Yeah. We don't have time to talk about the double bind. In our chapter, I also talk about Bateson's theory of double bind, which ties into this very nicely. But very often, when the reality experienced by a child is persistently denied, particularly when these are traumatic events, it gets stored somehow in the body or in the emotions. I was going to spend a little time talking about disorganized attachment, but I don't think I really have the time for this today. I'll just tell you that there's a whole body of research now looking at these very disturbed early attachment experiences. And what they're focusing on more and more is the communication, the relationship, the implicit contact between parent and child. There's one study that looked at this in particular, and I will read you what she concludes in her study. This is a little illustration of a young child who ends up becoming quite dissociative as an adult. So she argues, Lisa Dutra, that the feelings and experiences that a child is allowed to express are powerfully shaped by the parents' reactions and lack of reactions. And that the infant, exquisitely sensitive to their environment and to their parents, and particularly to the face of their mother and their father, modifies their behavior and basically learns to disconnect from pain and distress. And she argues that they are being taught not only not to recognize their internal experiences, but not to talk about them, which is really the double bind, quite clearly the double bind. And that the child's learn very early on they must not acknowledge these internal experiences. I think I'm going to skip this. Okay.
Yeah, did they not find in disassociated attachment that neglect is more difficult to treat than actually very abusive relationships, because at least there is a relationship.
We're finding like emotional neglect in particular.
Yeah,
physical neglect is one thing, but emotional neglect is really devastating.
It's the whole brain.
Yeah. I mean, this whole, physical trauma, sexual trauma, horrible things, but the context in which they occur, and the ongoing chronic. Yeah, in this study too, the double bind talks about that too as well. They're not talking about trauma, they're talking about ongoing chronic interchanges that break down the person's sense of themselves and of the world. So why do people become delusional? Well, it reduces overwhelming affect. Importantly, people who are traumatized, delusions keep their traumas from out of their mind, out of awareness. Because for many people, remembering what happened is the worst possible thing you can do. And actually, when I worked forensically, part of what delusions do actually, which in many ways is very creative and probably a solution to the double bind, it allows people to express things they're not allowed to express. It allows the expression of forbidden affect, forbidden actions, because it's not really their fault, right? They're crazy. You can't blame them for what they're doing. So I worked with a number of people who had killed their parents, often under the influence of what we call Capgras delusions, feeling that their mother or their father has been replaced by an imposter. And actually that the imposter has kidnapped the real mother or father. And then they express enormous anger for this. And if you look into it very often, there's the affect itself, the emotion, seems to be related to actual early childhood experiences. So we talked earlier about Jasper's Wahrnehmung, delusional mood. This is how he describes it. patients feel uncanny, something's wrong with the environment, that there is this distrustful, uncomfortable, uncanny tension, foreboding, as you mentioned, this sense something horrible is going to happen. And Jaspers himself recognized that coming up with a delusion is a relief. It's a relief. Now I know why I feel so horrible. It's because they're trying to poison me. So what we argue in our chapter is that what Jaspers talks about here, it sounds an awful lot like how you might imagine disorganized attachment to be. An infant with a parent who appears frightened of them or appears terrifying. An example, disorganized attachment would be a parent who's pretend playing to be a tiger or a lion, but actually is much more aggressive and is frightening the hell out of the infant. What you're seeing there is an expression of their own traumatic experiences there. So we argue that these early attachment experiences are stored in the body or in the emotions, and that they can be expressed later in life. I didn't show you this slide by Giovanni Liatti, but the attachment system, when it's triggered, can bring back these very early memories. And of course, you don't know their memories. And they can be interpreted delusionally. And also, disorganized attachment can theoretically involve the infant feeling as though they're the cause of the problem. My mommy is terrified. She's scared of me. I must be so powerful. I must be so dangerous. You can imagine these feelings can be the foundation for grandiose delusions, right? I can control the world. Okay, there's a really interesting article by Freud on unheimlich, on the uncanny, the same word that Jaspers used. But we don't have time to talk about that today. Sorry. This is the usual problem for me. There's just so much I want to tell you, and we don't have enough time. So the argument is that delusions are really memory-based, and these delusions can occur from very early on in life. How do we prove this? It's not easy. So this is a theory that we will have some difficulty proving, but it's consistent with some of what we know. And it can serve to keep the trauma from consciousness, and they may also be the foundation for paranoia, grandiosity, this terrible sense of foreboding. So I think I'm going to give you a few examples, and then we'll finish up. There's a psychoanalyst by the name of David Garfield out of Chicago, and he's written a book on the psychotherapy of psychosis called Unbearable Affect. And he really argues that delusions develop because of a situation the person can't deal with. And that if you can identify when this delusion first occurred, what was the first time the person got this crazy idea in their life, that can give you clues as to what it's about, because there was something in their environment. I don't have time to tell you the story from his chapter there, but it's a very interesting one. Snakes in the bed. From my experience, years ago I worked with a person in the forensic mental hospital who had this delusion that there were snakes in his bed. And classically, in people who are psychotic or schizophrenic, they don't actually see things that often. They don't often misperceive the environment. For example, another woman I worked with early on knew that this famous politician wanted to marry her. Why? He didn't say that he wanted to marry her, but he was wearing a red sweater, a red jumper, and that meant that he wanted to marry her. So this person, he didn't see any snakes in his bed. What happened is when he went to sleep at night and he pulled the covers over his body, he would start to feel something on his skin. And this was something slithering around, and it felt disgusting and it was frightening. We think he was sexually abused by his brother when he was younger, and that his brother would come into his bedroom and come into his bed and abuse him. And probably there's something about the nighttime or the sheets that's triggering these memories, triggering these flashbacks. But he doesn't know their memories, and he probably doesn't want to know their memories. It's much easier to imagine there are snakes in your bed which also relate to how he might have felt fearful, frightened, disgusted. So the delusion fits the bill in some ways. He'd rather have that delusion than remember what actually happened to him. How many of you have seen Shutter Island? Scorsese's Shutter Island? A really interesting, nice movie. Although these visual hallucinations that he has, that's not terribly typical, really. But the basic idea behind Shutter Island, person's this way because of an overwhelming trauma that he really just cannot deal with and he cannot integrate. And that's the basic argument that I want to suggest to you today. Okay,
Or a
so.
beautiful mind.
Yeah, A Beautiful Mind, well, we don't know so much about his history, though. He's just, and once again, A Beautiful Mind is much more dissociative. You know, seeing these scenes is not at all typical of schizophrenia. So if I was to summarize what these last 3 lectures have been about, I would argue that understanding trauma and dissociation is very important to understanding schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms. And also recognizing dissociative disorders, very important. Both psychosis and schizophrenia are poorly defined. The schizophrenia diagnosis should rely much more on negative symptoms, cognitive impairment, disturbances of self and self-other boundaries. And dissociative disorders must be better recognized because they're out there. You know, people think these things are really rare. They're not rare. They're actually reasonably common, and they're pretty. The diagnoses are fairly valid. It's just hard to recognize them. We need more diagnoses. There used to be reactive psychosis, cycloid psychosis. We need post-traumatic stress disorder with psychotic symptoms. We need dissociative psychosis. We need more diagnoses. Voice hearing makes much more sense as dissociative than as psychotic and should be treated relationally. Delusions are meaningful, often related to life experiences. Recognizing their meaning can help with their integration. So, they knew it. I mean, back then, 110 years ago, Bleuler and Jung, Pierre Genet, even Freud, although I disagree with many of his ideas, he always thought these things were very meaningful. They had a meaning. And we have lost that now. And I suggest we need to go back to some of these ideas. Okay, thank you. All right, where do we begin? Yes?
Yeah, well, thank you for another lovely lecture. I have a somewhat random question, but earlier when you were talking about voice hallucinations,
Yeah.
you mentioned that almost all victims of sexual abuse do have auditory hallucinations, hearing voices.
Yeah, I don't think I quite said that, but go on.
Well,
I think.
got hung up on that.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure you did say that, but if you want to
No.
clarify. Okay, so that's what I remembered, and my question would be then, if you did say that, if you were talking about childhood victims of sexual abuse, or if you were talking more generally.
Yeah, well, I think what I recall, and you know, my memory may be a bit off too, is that victims of sexual abuse who hear voices almost always hear the voice of the perpetrator.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that is almost always going to happen. But of course, not all persons who are sexually abused do hear voices. And there's a lot, what we don't know very well at all is what are the consequences of adult sexual assault for people who have a history of child abuse versus people who don't. We haven't done enough of those studies because we don't, you know, a lot of these studies that have showed rape, for example, to be so predictive of delusions, they didn't really try to separate that. And of course, some of these people will also have a history of childhood abuse. So we need to look at that. Yeah. You had a question?
Yes, and I don't know if I should ask that, because I was yesterday watching randomly YouTube things, and I get to the point where I saw something that I didn't know, that this famous hysteric Sabine Spielrein, she got actually a thesis about schizophrenia, and I was wondering if you know something about it, because it was a thesis somehow.
Sabine Spielrein is a fascinating figure, and she.
Schizophrenia So maybe what does she say about
Yeah, I don't know so much what she says about schizophrenia. Some people credit her with, the thanatos, with the notion of the death instinct, if I recall correctly. But there were a number of women very early on who had a lot of really good ideas that have not been credited appropriately. But yeah, Sabine Spielrein is a very interesting figure. I don't know. No. I mean, Jung, as many of you probably know, went off fairly quickly to focus on archetypes and to focus on schizophrenia as this expression of archetypal, which is interesting and is important, but what concerns me is that can lead people to overlook actual very early experiences that contribute to this as well. So I think we shouldn't run too quickly to some of those ideas unless we've explored the actual early history as well. Yeah.
One is that I have a feeling that it is a vicious circle of fear that is happening with people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia or get this diagnosis, because as if that everything starts with the fear, and then later on they are terrified, and then later on the society and the people who work with them are terrified, and we are unable to help them in that system. So I was wondering if we can maybe help.
I mean, the first, if you look at people who work very effectively with these folks, there's a great Spanish colleague of mine, Dolores Mosquera, who is the most matter-of-fact, relaxed, calm person you can imagine. And she's dealing with people who have, incredibly crazy ideas and talking about killing themselves, talking about hurting her. But she's just really relaxed, very matter-of-fact, treating them like anyone else, with humor as well. And I think for a lot of people, the idea, I'm sitting with a schizophrenic, terrifies them, and then it terrifies the person. And you're absolutely right, it builds around. And there are many people, Bertrand Caron, who was one of the first to argue for the psychotherapy of schizophrenia, talked about terror, that what is at the core of this disorder is terror. And it moves on from there. Yeah, I'll come back to you in a sec. Okay? Yep.
She had two questions. She can
Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering what happened with the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. Why is it neglected, and maybe
Yeah.
you can comment?
So, well, sure. It's a really interesting question because, for most of the 20th century, it was ignored, probably partly because schizophrenia was so broad. Because the diagnosis of schizophrenia was so broad, it probably included a lot of people with this diagnosis. And then in the 80s and so, people started recognizing it more. My feeling is that it really frightens people, the possibility of this existence, and not so much because there's tremendous abuse histories often, but the idea that there can be multiple centers of consciousness, if you will, in one body is, I think, on a gut level, very terrifying to many people. So they cannot allow that to come close. So they don't want to consider the possibility of this disorder existing. It just sounds too bizarre, and I think it personally threatens them as well. But I'm involved with some people who are trying to figure this question out a little bit better, because it's an important one. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering, talking about how voice hearing and delusions are much more common than being diagnosed, which I would agree with.
Right?
I was wondering, is it always the same root? And meaning events that are not so easy to deal with, like integratable, and then we should think about trauma as a term, and maybe it's more like a spectrum.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure it makes sense to talk about trauma as a spectrum, because I think the fundamental problem with trauma is that most everything we experience during our lives we can integrate, we can make sense of, we can deal with in some fashion. Some things we don't think about too much, but with trauma, it's a very powerful experience that we cannot integrate. maybe there are some more minor things that kind of don't make sense to us, but they wouldn't be as disturbing then. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to think about trauma on a continuum.
But the symptoms, more like, because it sounds
Sure.
pretty familiar
Sure.
to me, this voice hearing.
Yeah, that can easily be on a continuum, and you can well imagine, for example, the experience, there's a symptom called audible thoughts where you experience your thoughts out loud, but you feel that they're your thoughts. And this seems less extreme than voices which are not your thoughts and you're hearing them. And people also have intrusive thoughts, so they have the experience of a thought that doesn't feel like it's theirs, but they're not hearing it. And of course, as many people have noted, our thinking is language-based, right? So we are talking to ourselves pretty much all the time. So thinking of that as a continuum, and delusion's the same thing. You know, we all have, you know, a very simple example, coincidences that happen to you, and you wonder, does this mean something, right? You might think about that for a few minutes, but you're not going to act on that. It's not going to form the core of your behavior. And delusional people may have a similar experience. Or even subtle things like, which can vary from culture to culture, eye contact. I mean, how do we know when somebody's looking at us in a normal or friendly way, or when their gaze is suggesting something more, which is what happens in delusional people a lot. It's not so difficult to figure this out. And I'll give you a little example. When I was in Denmark, before coming here, I remember, you know, the Danish people are often very friendly, you know, smile very easily. And I went to some sort of a lecture or a presentation where there was a guy across the way and he was smiling at me. And where I come from in America, you only do that if you know somebody. So this went on for a while, and I went up to him and I said, have I met you before? He said, no, I'm just happy you're here, or something like that. So I misinterpreted, on a cultural basis, what was happening there. And that clearly is on a continuum with delusions. Yeah.
So sorry if I...
Yeah.
Because the so-called symptoms, they're always around, it's about controlling what is happening to me and also processing what I experienced. And it just makes sense to me if I experience something very severe and very extreme, then of course this normal function of the mind goes higher and higher. That's how I would explain it. Would you?
Maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe.
I've actually been using, in my practice, I've been using internal family systems, but as it fits into drama therapy.
Right.
And what I've been starting to use is that if someone comes with me that has a traumatic, that has something in the here and now, and we find out that there's an attachment issue, an attachment element to this. And I sometimes ask them, so close your eyes and go to the part that is constantly telling you you're going to die. Taking an example. And then at one point, I was with someone who's very susceptible to this conversation, and I said, just allow it to come up. Whatever comes up, we won't judge it, we won't say it's true or not. We're going to experiment with it. We're in the experimental space. And then I was watching her and said, how old is this part? And it ended up being quite young, and she was very adamant, 5. And so when it was 5, I said, can you go towards it? And so there ended up being some integration between her, and I said, can you let this part know you're grown up? And then one of the things, the homework that I gave her, was to actually talk out loud to the part. So rather than keeping it internal, where you can't differentiate in order to integrate, because you have to differentiate in order to integrate.
Yeah. I mean,
way better.
In a funny way, in a strange way, people who hear voices have somewhat of an advantage in a way, because they have externalized these parts of them that they can then deal with. And people who are disturbed in other ways, or healthy people, it's a lot harder for them to activate, energize,
And her saying it out loud, she literally would say, when she got into this panic mode, say, okay, we need to go to sleep now. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Right, and it probably worked.
And that enormous fear would just subside.
Okay, I'm going to tell you this little story before we finish from David Garfield, because I think it's really quite nice, and it'll help to illustrate some of what we've been talking about. So he believes that delusions, people create delusions when they can't deal with these overwhelming affect. So there was a fellow who was paralyzed, who was in a wheelchair and had developed this delusion that he had been healed, that he'd been cured, that he could walk. And he had gone to a political event, and he was creating a spectacle by crawling around and screaming and saying, "I've been healed, I don't need my crutches anymore, I don't need my wheelchair anymore, I can walk." And he was taken by the police to a psychiatric hospital, and then after a few days he came to see David Garfield. So David Garfield asked him, tell me where this idea first came up. And this story came out, that this fellow, we'll call him John, John worked for a politician. And John and this politician were in a van, in a car, on the way to a political event where the politician was about to speak. And the politician was driving and John was in the middle seat. And on his right was a young woman who also worked for this politician. And as they were driving to this event, about 20 minutes or so, the young woman and the politician were talking animatedly with each other and ignoring John. He was sort of in the middle, being left out. And by the time they got to the event, he was psychotic. He was agitated, he was completely delusional. So David Garfield asked him, okay, so did this idea come into your head at a particular point? Were you thinking, were you talking, were you looking out the window? He said, I was looking out the window. And what did you see? He said, I saw a football field, American football, gridiron. And Garfield stupidly said, did you ever play football? And John said, no, idiot. I've been paralyzed since I was six from polio. But he knew that football field because he had gone to university there. And the story then came out that when he was at university there, he made friends with a woman. And this woman's former boyfriend was a football player, was an athlete. And she and John would go to these football games, and afterwards the former boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, the football player would, talk to them, was always very nice to John, so they seemed to have a good relationship. But then one time, after a football game, the football player came and was speaking to John and his friend, and John's friend, the woman, was speaking to the football player, and both of them were ignoring John. And at that moment, John had the feeling that she still loves him. She still loves the football player. And he also felt, and she'll never love me. And he felt shame, and he felt despair, but he didn't become psychotic. So he put that in a corner of his mind somewhere. And then years later, he was in a situation that felt a little bit like the same thing all over again. He looked out the window, he saw that football field. These feelings came back, but he didn't know they were memories. And somehow this feeling of shame was transformed into this delusion that he was cured and he could walk, probably because that was his wish. If he could walk, she would have loved him. His life would have been different. And now it wasn't. And when Garfield worked with him and they got to the core of this delusion, of this memory, delusion went away. He didn't need it anymore because he could deal with the emotions that were driving it, that were underpinning it. I can't say this happens all the time, maybe not even most of the time, but maybe it does, maybe it could.
I have a story about misdiagnosis. My son was in.
I think we should. We can talk after that, but we're already past time, so I think we should stop then. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.